Good Wednesday morning, all. I'm glad you tuned in. Here we go. We're back at the purpose-driven life, reading through the book together. We come to chapter 13. Rick had just spent a couple of chapters on being friends with God, and now he turns specifically to worship. Actually, I'm a lot more comfortable with this topic because I love to worship our God. And there's two very key verses. Boy, there's a lot in this chapter. I hope you're reading along with me because I can't do the whole chapter justice. But if you're not reading the book, just concentrate on these verses because they'll be worth your time for sure. The first point is the very one he starts the chapter with, Mark 12, verse 20. And it makes it so clear that when we worship God, he wants all of us. I know he means all of us, but he means all of each one of us. Each one of us. The verse says, love the Lord your God, and note all these alls. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. I don't think you could miss catching the fact that he wants all of us. And that is what this chapter is about. And Rick makes that so clear and what that will entail, what it means. He doesn't want half-hearted commitment. When we go to worship, he doesn't want you checking your phone, see if you got a text during the first song. He wants you to concentrate, be present, be with him, full devotion. Therefore, Rick makes the point, there are four characteristics of a worship that's pleasing to God. And to make his point, he uses primarily the other verse that I think is so key. That first one is key. This one is key. It's on the next page, at least in my edition. And it's John 14 at verse 23. And he was talking to the Samaritan woman, Jesus was. And he says to her, true worshipers, and we want that to be a description of us, don't we? Sure we do. Sure we do. True worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers that the Father seeks. And so, as Rick says, this comes under the title, God is pleased when our worship is accurate, and he wants it in spirit and in truth. But first point was to worship him in truth, to worship God as he truly is. Rick makes the point where he says people like to say, well, I like to think of God as such and such. No, I don't care whether you like to think of God as such and such. Think of God who the Bible describes. And that always is why I think you need to have read a book on the characteristics or attributes of God. And there's quite a few out there, and they're all good, I'm sure. My favorite is Knowledge of the Holy, and I've recommended it often. But whatever you do, learn to think in terms of God of the Bible, not the God the way that culture would describe it. So that's the true worshipers will worship in spirit and in truth. Then Rick goes into number 2, God is pleased when our worship is authentic. And that's what he's talking about in spirit. And you know, when he says worship in spirit, that's not his spirit, that's your spirit. He wants your spirit to be in line with his, and that your spirit, I think it goes along with that all of me. Worship in your spirit is merely responding to God's spirit. Just an excellent, excellent point. And then he gives a lot of information on worship there, and I hope you can read all that. But the third point he makes is that God is pleased when our worship is thoughtful. You know, Jesus's command was to love God with all your mind. And that was repeated 4 times in the New Testament. That's really why, of course, sermons are a part of worship. A good church has a good sermon, period. A good explaining of God's holy word. That needs to be a part of a worship service. Why? Because we're to worship him with all our mind. Our mind needs to be engaged. And even then, and so I would take the challenge to keep my mind involved. And he said, sometimes he come and say, well, this sermon, it doesn't seem to apply to me. I'll just kind of check out. You can always find a verse or verses or a story or something that God would use in your spirit to draw you closer to your Lord. Look for it. Look for it. Look for it. And then, oh, I love this one. Rick makes the point to be specific. And that, in other words, God would rather that we can say, praise you, Lord, hallelujah, praise you, Lord. And when we repeat it, that's fine. And maybe your spirit is doing that. But like he says, let me read his. If someone approached you and repeated, I praise you 10 times, you'd probably think, for what? For what? You'd rather have 2 specific compliments. In other words, hey, I want to praise you and thank you for such and such. Man, that's meaningful, but just not, I want to thank you. So look at it from the Lord's point of view. He would love you to be specific. And finally, that God is pleased when our worship is practical. In other words, we put it into action. And Romans 12:1 says that action is a part of worship. That is, he calls giving of yourself, that you are offering your bodies as a spiritual act of worship. Rick says, I have to chuckle at this because I've heard it so many times. But Rick had bugged enough to put in his book. And he says, you've heard people say, I can't make it to the meeting tonight, but I'll be with you in spirit. And and then Rick says, do you know what that means? Nothing. It's worthless. As long as you're on earth, your spirit can only be where your body is. They can't be with you in spirit. Anyway, I think it's something for us to resist saying, or even analyzing to ourselves. Oh, I'll be with them in spirit instead of actually making the effort to go. And that's what, of course, worship is, that you make the effort and you do the practical things. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. I think you and I have been challenged today. I can't wait to see what Rick has for us in chapter 14 tomorrow. See you then.
Oh, come to the Father through Jesus the Son, and give him